Boom! Welcome back to Casino Guitars. That's right, we're here with the Two-Rock Studio Signature. It's a really cool amp that we all know and love very well here at the shop, and we figured that we'd give you a little rundown of it and kind of explain all the nuances of it and a lot of what the switching does. I personally feel like that's something that's missing out there, is a real good, just kind of deep tonal rundown of it. So we've got Sweet Baxter on guitar over there, ready to rip for us while I talk you through what all this amp is capable of and a lot of the nuances of what each part of it does. So starting off, whenever they designed these, they actually took an older design, which was called their Pro Studio, and what they did was, I think it was the Pro Studio Signature to be exact. They went through and kind of revamped and retweaked a lot of those things and added some of the features that they had brought back to it, right? Some of those features include the gain staging that's on the back. There's a 3-click switch, which we're going to run through here in just a moment. And the way that those go down is the original kind of Two-Rock sound, the setting. It's closest to like a Classic Reverb, which is pushed from the gain up here. The middle setting is a little crunchier. It kind of reminds me, I know they call it like the Schofield setting, but it reminds me of the most overdriven kind of Fender sound. And then all the way down at the bottom, it's closest to kind of like a Blackface Deluxe Reverb. So nice vintage tone. And starting off, what we're going to do is go right through that first one. Here you go. All right, and here goes that Schofield setting that's nice and crunchy. And finally, that Blackface setting, which is also, it's got a little bit of a mid-scoop to it, just like most Fender amps do. So pay attention to that whenever you listen to it. So I'm going to flip it all the way back up to that first setting to set us back to basics, right? Now, starting off, we've got our gain here, right? Now, per each one of those settings, that gain interacts slightly different with the amp. But what's really cool about it, I think, is that as you turn this master volume, it interacts with it as well, right? So the more that we push the gain, we're getting more bass, right? But the more that we push the master volume, we're getting more natural overdrive. So don't just think of this gain as what you would on most amps, where I'm going to turn this up and everything's going to get gnarlier. Actually, if you turn up the master, it gets a little bit gnarlier, and the gain is pushing a lot more of the sustain, a lot more of the overall low end of the amp, which is really cool to hear. I'm going to get into that more later as we get into these switches. But definitely suggest starting off at 12 on both of these usually, right? If you start off there, what you're going to find is pretty much the most pristine sound of the tone. That's what I've got everything set to here. Now, as we go down, we're going to move right into these switches. And we got the bright switch to start off with. It is what it seems to be, as it says, right? I'm going to flip that up, and you're actually going to hear a sparkle and shine to it, all right? Here we go. What's really cool about this is not only is it a traditional bright switch where it's going to push a lot of that high presence in, but using the presence knob or the gain knob, you can actually contour that, right? And it's going to actually make it sound a lot better. So what I'm going to do now is show you that by pushing the gain up, we're going to hear a low end, and what that does is almost make, it makes like an illusion that that brightness goes away, but it's just because there's more low end there, so it actually evens it out. Here we go. cool. What I think is a lot of fun is playing around with that bright switch and that gain knob. But if you wanted even more from that, what I'm going to do is pull down on the presence. Okay, and I'm also going to let you hear it on the deluxe reverb sound too with this, because I think it sounds really cool as we push that. I'm going to push the gain just a little bit to give us just a little more low end on it. But the presence is pulled down, and we're going to talk more about these EQ knobs here in a minute, but I want to show you that with the bright switch quickly. Here we go. All in all, with the bright switch, what I love, because I usually hate bright switches, I love the fact that I can actually take that switch and get even more dynamic out of it. I can actually make it what I want it to be. And most of the time, I don't get that out of a bright switch. Usually, I want to leave it off. If it's a Fender amp, I leave it off. But on the Fender setting, even on this, I find it to be very usable and very cool and dynamic. So moving right along, what we're going to move into is the mid here, right? So I'm putting everything back to 12, as we've said before, making sure everything's all good. The mid is just a mid push on this, right? So we're all the way back up in our 2-rock setting here, and as we run through this, you're going to hear it push those mids, which is more of the meat, but also hear how it kind of pushes just a little bit of overdrive onto the amp, which is really cool in my opinion too. Here we go. Always a great sound. If you flip that switch, what it's going to do is help you cut through a lot of the mixes. And also know too, as we're going through these, once we get to these knobs, we're going to talk about how they also accentuate these, right? They kind of take them to a whole nother level outside of the amazing things the EQ section does to this amp. But I want to get to the deep end real quick. So whenever we flip this deep switch, what is really cool is it actually fills out the chord more. That's because it's taking where normally that bass section is pushed a little bit higher, closer to the low mid frequency area. It's actually moving that section down, and it's getting more into the lower frequencies, which frees up mid room for the actual mid sonic of the guitar. So it gives a deeper presence to that low end, more well-rounded. You'll hear that in the bass end of it. And then as the middle of it is pushed too, you'll hear a little more clarity in the overall chord tone. It's sick. Get ready for this. As I said, you heard a lot more clarity in that, right? It's not driving it as much. Now, if we flip that mid switch up, it's obviously going to do that, all right? We're going to get into some of our flavor things like that later on and mix some of these things together. But for now, what I'd like to do is talk about this EQ section. So going through each one of these, what I want to point out is that 2-Rock did a great job making sure that you have total control over the frequency range, right? So if I roll this bass all the way down, I think this is the best place to see it starting off, is it grounds that signal almost. And I'm going to turn this back up and let Baxter play for a second, and I think you'll notice right away how much it goes away. All right, here we go. Pretty neat, right? That's a weird sound, but in a studio setting, you might just find a place for something like that. It's nice and wonky. Now, if we go all the way the other way, it sends the amp into an overdrive territory that is really cool whenever you hear it. And I'm going to push that all the way up now. Note that this is going to sound a little wonky. I'm going to try and not go absolutely all the way, but it drives it and it gives a really cool character to the overall sound of the amp. Once again, in a studio situation or maybe even in a live situation, you might want to use something like this. All right, here we go. All right, so it has a lot more well-rounded bass into it too. But what I'm going to do too is push this middle up, because we know if we cut out the middle, it's just scooping the mids, right? We're going to push that up and give it more of that driven sound. I'm going to pull the bass back just a little bit. I'm going to push the treble up just a little bit so you can kind of hear how it drives the preamp section of this amp. So pulling all those back to the middle where we had them before, right at noon. All right, cool. So really, really usable EQ section on these amps, and most 2-Rocks have that. It's one of my favorite factors of them, especially as a studio tool, is you can really dial in what you want to do. What's really cool about that mid section too is if you need more cut or you need to push it in a live situation, let's say you're outside, you can turn that up and get that, right? It's going to help you cut through the mix. Same thing with the treble section. You can push it or pull it all the way down. And then as you flip around with the gain section on the back, if you go all the way to the Fender area, you can really mold and get some cool things out of it as well. And then the gain section, which I personally love, is just going to give you more crunch in all those areas. But moving on to the next part here, we got reverb, right? So in the back of the amp, we have a reverb send knob, right? And this knob is really cool because we can send it and get it almost cavernous and get really like surf rock swampy with it, which is nice. So I'm going to give you the utmost reverb possible right here and let Baxter get surfy for us. Here we go. Pretty neat, right? I love that sound. It's super cool, but we can also dial it way back, right? What's cool about that return knob on the front is that if I were to turn it up now, you're going to have a lot of that wash still there, but it's not as heavy in the mix. So you can still have a lot of wash, but it's not taking over your sound like that was there. But I'm going to go way back down and trim that down to where it's almost like a small room. And I'm going to get that just right. Here we go. That's back to noon there, but I've got my send down. So here we go. So that's just giving you enough to give you the idea of reverb, really. And it's very tasteful. I like that a lot. Pretty much from there, I want to show you what the master can do if we push it and we get that drive sound. And we're going to go through each section of the amp so you can hear that. So pushing the master now, and I'm just going to roll the gain up just a little bit past 12. I'm also going to flip that bright switch up and flip the deep switch up to kind of give us a little bit more room so we can hear some of that natural overdrive come from the amp. All right, here we go on the 2-Rock setting, and then just dialing our reverb back up, and then we're going to move down each one after that. Here we go. Awesome. So going from there, what we're going to go into is all the way down. So we're at the top at the 2-Rock setting. We're going all the way down to the Fender setting because I want to save the best one for last. All right, so now we're on the deluxe reverb side of this thing. We're going to let it rip and let's hear what it sounds like. Very cool, right? So now here we go for that Schofield setting. I'm going to make one minor adjustment here. I'm going to push our mids just a bit in this so we can get a little more meat on, a little more hair. All right, here we go. Very neat, right? This amp has a ton of dynamic range to it, and I highly suggest if you purchase one of these or if you're looking at getting one of these to watch your video here, check all that out and re-watch it a couple of times because it can be a bit confusing, but just knowing and hearing the nuances of what each one of these switches do, how that EQ section really works and carves out the tone of what's going on, it really makes a huge difference. It made me appreciate these amps more, especially the Studio Signature here, which I think is a phenomenal amp. What I'm going to leave you out with and let Baxter play on is in that Schofield crunch section. I'm going to push the gain a little bit more and let it be wide open. Pull the master back slightly. Dial up our presence. Let's see, right about there. All right, here you go.